Turtle Logo lesson number 1, Advanced, where we're going to be making Hello World using variables and sprites. So in this lesson, we're going to be using the Turtle Logo programming language, and we're going to be using variables and sprites to make our turtle object show up on our screen. So the pictures that we're going to be using, we're going to refer to them as turtle objects because it's not just a picture or what we're going to call a sprite later on. It actually has logic behind it that it knows how to understand commands we're going to give it and follow through and do those commands. And those commands are held in this thing called a turtle object. So these images, we're always going to refer to them as turtle objects, even though you can make it a turtle picture, but in our case, we're going to make them several different pictures. So technical stuff before we begin. Before we start coding, we have to make sure that we understand what a variable is in programming and how to use it and create it. So a variable in its simplest sense in programming is just a memory location that holds something. And it can hold all kinds of things. Over in the menu bar here of our code, you can see there's a section called variables, and at the moment we don't have any variables. We can use this button, make a variable, to actually create one. So we're going to select that and we're going to create our first variable. In the picture you just saw, instead of a turtle, we're actually going to start off with a duck. So a good name for our variable is going to be called my duck. Now you'll notice a few things about this. First off, we don't write it like we would write something in English class. And this is on purpose. So variable names in programming have a very distinct way of writing them. The first letter is usually small, and each word is not separated by, in English class we would put a space. They are separated by every other word begins with a capital. So our duck begins with a capital D. This standard is called camel case, yes, like the animal, camel, and it's very common to name variables this way so that other programmers can understand what you're doing. In math class, you might have used variables like A means area, or W means width, or L means length. In math class, we use short forms, single letters, to represent things because we're usually writing them out by hand and it takes a long time. In the computer, we only usually write out our variable name once, so we want to be very descriptive and give it a name that means something and that other people will understand. So since we're creating a duck, it would make sense to call it my duck. And then you just say, okay. So a couple things have happened. We have some new blocks that got created because we created this variable, and I'm just going to drag out some of them. So this set block is used, I'm going to place it in start, is to assign a value to our variable. So we have this variable called my duck, and we're assigning it the value 0. So we're taking the number 0 and we're putting it into the memory location we are calling my duck. That's what this block does. Another block that you can use is called change. So change my duck by 1, and what that does is whatever value currently is in the variable my duck, it's going to add 1 to it. So it started out at 0, and then we can add 1. We could choose to set my duck to 10, and then after the change block happens, then my duck would be 11 because we changed it by 1. We added 1 to it. You'll notice there's a little drop-down menu. So we currently only have one variable called my duck. You can create new variables, you can change its name, or you can remove this variable completely. So we actually could create several variables. So I'm going to make another variable, and I'm going to call it my apple. And you'll notice two variables show up. So these little stadium-sized shaped pieces, they are variables, and they will only click into certain locations. So we could actually, I'm going to pick out a different one actually. I'm going to pick out my apple. So I'm going to set my duck to be whatever the variable my apple happens to be. So whatever my apple is, that value is now being put into the variable location my duck. So you can select whenever you see a set or a change and you see this reddish kind of color, those are referring to variables. So we're going to use those in a few moments. Just have to make sure that we understand how to create them, how to use them, and how to delete them if we need to get rid of them. So the next term we're going to see is this term called sprite. And a sprite is just a two-dimensional image that is actually going to show up in our game console. So the 2D images or sprites are part of the turtle object. They're not everything about the turtle object. There are variables that are just sprites. Our turtle object can understand more than just showing up an image. It can also follow the commands we're going to give it. So a sprite is just a picture, and we're going to be using that in a few moments. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we're going to create our variable myDuck, and we've already done that. So we're already set and ready to go. You'll notice it says set myDuck to null. So at the moment, this variable has nothing in it. Okay, so 0 is different than nothing. Null means that there is nothing at all in that memory location. It's just completely empty. So we're already set, we're ready to go. We already have our variable. Okay, now what we notice is that there is already a block that showed up in our program over here, and it was the onStart block. So the onStart block comes by default. If for some reason you delete it, so you can just drag it and drop it and delete it, you can always go to loops and get it back. You can only ever have one onStart because it wouldn't make sense to have more than one, because then both of them are going to run. So you'll notice it goes gray if you try to take out a second one. So any blocks that go inside this, when our program first starts up, when we hit the run button, that code will be executed. Okay, now we finally get to the point where we can make a turtle object. So it's called the turtle object because we're using these turtle commands. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a turtle. In fact, we're going to make a duck to begin with. So we're going to drag out this long block first, and then I'm going to explain what it is. Actually, I'm going to put it here. I'm going to drag it and pull it apart. And then I'm only going to put a piece in. So this block we've already seen before. It was under variables, set my turtle to 0. So this is a piece of this block. So by default, when we drag this out, it gives us a default value called myTurtle, but we want to use the variable that we created called myDuck. So you can just select the variable that we wanted to create. And we're going to set this variable to something. And this is the special part of the block, so it's also the stadium shape, so it can click in. So instead of putting the number 0 into our variable, we're going to put this special thing. And the special thing is a turtle object. So that's why we keep referring to them as turtle objects. So this dark green color sets this variable to be a turtle object. And this turtle object has special things that it can do. And one of them is that it can show a sprite of kind player. Now, player refers to MakeCode Arcade, which is the programming environment we're using. Players are certain sprites that have special features that can show up on our game console over here. We're going to use this sprite of kind player, and we're going to assign it into our turtle object. So this code is run. You can see I can stop it and run it again, but nothing is actually showing up because the sprite that we're choosing right here in this little stadium piece is nothing. So the next thing we're going to need to do is to actually change that. So if you just select it, you get this option. So you could draw your own. This is a little paint kind of program. There's 16 different colors. You can draw your own duck if you want to, and you're really good at drawing. You're more than welcome to do that. The other option is this gallery, and you'll notice that there's several pre-made pictures for us. And I'm just going to go select this duck, and it will populate it for me. You'll notice this checkerboard color here, and it's the first color choice. That actually just means that it's transparent, that it's no color at all. So you'll just see the background. When we're done, we click on Done. So there we go. Now we have set our variable called myDuck to actually be a turtle object with sprite duck of kind player. And now you'll notice my duck shows up. So this is how you take a variable and assign it to be this turtle object. Once you have that turtle object in memory in this variable, then you can get it to do things for us. So the first thing that we are going to get our turtle to do, as all good programmers do, is we're going to get it, turtle object, it's actually a duck. We're going to get it to say hello world. So it's tradition in programming to always get your code to say hello world back to you. So here's our block. We don't actually want this variable myTurtle. We want our duck one because we're saying get the object myDuck to say hello world, and it's this object that we just created here. If we want to get rid of that variable called myTurtle because it just comes in by default, you can just alternate click and say delete, and it will delete the variable. So that's one way you can do it. We can even get rid of the Apple one since we don't really need it as well. And there you go. So we can take this block and we can add it in to our code. And you will notice that our turtle object that happens to be of sprite duck shows up and it says hello world. And then it goes away. So it goes away because by default, if you click on this little plus symbol, you'll see that it just shows up for 5,000 milliseconds, which is the equivalent of 5 seconds. If we want to change that to make it show up for longer, we can actually just change this. So I'm going to put in 30,000 milliseconds, which is the equivalent of 30 seconds. And then our program will run again, only if you press run. And hello world will show up and it'll stay there for 30 seconds. So the assignment for you is to get the turtle to turtle object. You can put whatever picture you want, pick something other than a duck, and you should probably even change your variable. If you're not going to pick a duck, if you're going to pick something else, make sure your variable name matches what you're doing. So you can go through and create another variable and change the variable names, change the sprite, and get it to say your name. And that's all we're going to do in this lesson.